Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome once again to the new... Look at this, more snow. This has been the endless winter, but we don't care. We have a nice, warm workshop to work in today. Now, we found a real nifty project at one of our favorite museums, Old Sturbridge Village. It's called a butterfly table. So what do you say we go out there and pay a visit, take a look at the antique, and then we'll come back here to the workshop, light a fire, and build our own version of the butterfly table. Go ahead, snow all you want.
Funding is provided by...
Welcome to the Common of Old Sturbridge Village, a collection of buildings assembled here in the 1940s to represent a Massachusetts village of a much earlier time, the early 19th century. It's a wonderful place to visit. I urge you to come here and experience what life might have been like in the early days of our nation. Now, here's the house we want to visit today, the Fenno House. Built in 1704 in Canton, Massachusetts, about 60 miles from here. It was carefully disassembled and brought here and put back together. It's a very simple farmhouse, and inside is the piece of furniture that I want to show you. Now, this is not a surprise. A tight hallway would be typical in a house of this era. Now, once you're in the front door, you have a couple choices. Either go left, right, or upstairs. Now, they've set up this house to represent life around 1830. And they imagine a widow and her daughter living here, and they maybe had a renter upstairs. It was still a farm, and there were a few sheep around, so that's why you see this wool, which they would have sheared off the sheep, cleaned, and then put it on this spinning wheel and made yarn. And once you have yarn, you can make things like this rug, or perhaps fabrics, which were really important around that time. And this fabric that we see on the loom might have been used on the front of a man's vest. There's an interesting collection of furniture in this room, and that would have come together over a long marriage. Here's a nice secretary desk. Over here, a gate-leg table with a lot of ornate turnings. And across the way, a simpler piece that at first glance looks like a dresser, but it's really not. The only drawer that operates is this bottom one. These are all fixed. It's actually a blanket chest with some Chippendale brasses. There's more on the other side. Once again, we cross through the front hallway into the kitchen, which would really be the work center of the house. Meals would be prepared here, laundry would be done, and candles would be made. And look at this fireplace. It's huge. Over here in the corner, a beehive oven. This was really the energy center of the house. And this is the piece I wanted you to see. They call it a butterfly table. It's early 18th century. It's an American piece made out of cherry. And let's check out the details. Stretchers go all the way around the bottom. Some nicely turned legs. And on the ends, they're actually splayed a bit. It's a drop leaf table, so you can easily drop the leaves to slide it up against the wall and take up less space. Or if you need more room to work at or eat, you fold the leaves up and support them with these decorative supports. As I look down on the top, I realize it's not round, it's slightly elliptical. This is a nice piece. This would fit in any home, whether it be 18th century or 21st century. Well, here it is, our version of that antique butterfly table. It's a pretty accurate copy of the antique. Now, I'm not sure if butterfly refers to the leaves or these decorative supports, but I'm sure someone will write into us and let us know. It has some nicely turned legs, stretchers wrap the bottom, rails at the top, and the top is actually an elliptical shape. It's 38 inches this way and 33 inches this way. This is just the kind of piece you might use in a bedroom where you could set a TV on it, or it could be an occasional table anywhere in the house. And if you drop one of these leaves, you can easily slide it up against the wall to take up less space. If you'd like to build your own version of the butterfly table, a measure drawing is available with a materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. I want to start today with the top, so I've selected some boards. Now, cherry can be tough. You can have wild grain, you can have a lot of color variation from one piece to the other, And occasionally you'll run into wood that has sapwood, or pieces that have sapwood, this white material, and I don't want to see that. So I've arranged these in what I think is the best combination of color and grain, and I want to glue them together. 2 pairs for the leaves, 1 for the center of the table. And you see this joint? This has to be perfect before I can glue it up. To straighten it out, we'll head over to the joiner. Before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, a joiner has a cutter head and 2 tables. This is the in-feed table where I've set the board. When the machine is running, the knives in the cutter head will remove material so that it slides onto the out-feed table and it straightens the board in the process. All right, let's see how we did. Now that's what we're trying to achieve. Now we can glue it up. Now we've used a variety of methods in joining the edges of boards together. Sometimes a glue joint, sometimes biscuits, but today I'm just going to use the glue. I have a lot of faith in the strength of the modern glues, and the last thing I want to have happen is a biscuit show when I cut that elliptical shape. When I put the pressure on here, just enough to squeeze the joint tightly together, not squeeze all the glue out of the joint. Well, now it's time to start working on the legs. And what I like to do on a project like this is make a full-scale drawing of the leg with all the details, every diameter, every distance from the bottom. And that becomes my reference over at the lathe. I've mounted a piece of cherry that's 1 3/4 inches square in the lathe. And now I can simply take the template, set it on top of the piece, and then mark where it's going to be square. Right here, right here, and right here. Now when I do lathe work, I have a full face mask. You don't want that piece coming off and hitting you. Now this part will be turned square and then turned up to the next square section. I'm going to start with this skew chisel and make the initial cut at the transition, and then I'll round off the area to be turned with a gouge. Okay, now that I have the round portions formed, I'll take my diagram once again and mark all the transition points. And then using a variety of tools, I'll form it. So the whole time I'm keeping my eye on that diagram, and once I think I'm close to the final diameter, take my caliper, set it to the diagram, bring it to the piece, and check it. And I can take a little more off of that. Now I'm pretty much going to form this by eye, using this spindle gouge and the tool rest as a guide. 1 down, 3 to go. The stretchers and the rails of our butterfly table are connected to the legs with mortise and tenon joinery. The mortises go in the legs. It's a very traditional method of building furniture, very strong, and we like to make the mortises with our dedicated mortiser. The drill bit does most of the work removing the material, and the chisel squares it up. All right, now in just a few seconds, I did something that would take me about 15 minutes with a drill bit and a chisel. Let's take another look at the prototype and see how the legs meet the top and the floor. On the long side of the table, they're at 90 degrees. But on the short side, the legs are splayed out at 10 degrees. So the top of the leg has to be cut at 10 degrees to be flush to the top, and the bottom needs to be cut to be flat on the floor. We'll do that at the table saw. So here I'll set my miter gauge at 10 degrees, and I'll cut the top first. I want to just come to the back corner. Now we'll adjust the stop a little bit shorter and get the end that meets the floor. All right, let's cut the top rail and the lower stretcher at 10 degrees. Here I'm beginning to form the tenons on the ends of the rails, and I'll do the same for the stretchers. I've set up a stop block, set the distance to give me a 7/8 inch long tenon and the depth at 5/16. We'll make a pass on each face on all ends. To make the shoulder cuts on the rails and stretchers that are cut at 10 degrees, I slide the piece up against the stop, swing it around so that there's no gap, and make a shoulder cut on each end. To get the remaining shoulder cut, I have to swing the miter gauge 10 degrees on the other side of 0. Here I'm beginning to form the top and bottom of each tenon, and I'm just nibbling it away with the saw blade. It goes pretty quickly, and there's really no need to set up a dado. Next are the cheek cuts, and to make those we're going to use our tenoning jig. And what it does is it holds the piece securely in a vertical position, and it keeps your hands far away from the blade. Now I want to complete the tenons on the rails and stretchers that have been cut at 10 degrees. So I've laid out the material to be removed, which is 90 degrees to the shoulder. I've set up this guide, and that'll make the shoulder cut at the top and bottom edge. Now I just complete the tenons freehand. All right, let's do a little bit of a dry fit here. Get the top rail and the stretcher on the tapered end together. That's pretty good. Now the long rail, if I slip it into the mortise and tip it up, you'll see that the top of it needs to be beveled at the same 10-degree bevel. We'll do that at the table saw. Let's take another look at the prototype, this time underneath. If you look, you can see that the top is secured to the base with some wooden clips that sit in a groove. Now the groove in the end piece is at 90 degrees. The groove in the side has to be at 10 degrees. I want to ease the edges on our stretchers, and now's the time to do it before assembly. And I'm using an 1/8 inch radius roundover bit. Finally, we're ready for a little assembly. I've put some glue in the mortise and some on each tenon. Okay. Now it's always a little difficult to clamp a tapered piece like this. So what I've done is I've cut a couple pieces of plywood at a 10-degree angle so that the clamps can stay straight, and it'll also keep the clamps from marring the surface of the legs. All right, we'll let this sit in the clamps for a couple minutes. There's something I want to do to those long stretchers. Let's tip the prototype up so you can see underneath here. I need a 1/2 inch hole in this stretcher to receive a pin that's in this support piece. If I were to drill the hole 90 degrees to this top surface, the axis of that hole would line up with the center of this rail. I want to kick it out about 3 degrees, so I'll drill the hole at 3 degrees. To drill that hole at 3 degrees, I've taken a scrap and ripped it at a 3-degree angle. I'll set that on the drill press first, then the stretcher, so now it's tipped 3 degrees, and I can drill the hole. All right. Well, I've used the same setup to glue together the other end of the table. I'll let that sit in the clamps for a few minutes, and before I leave tonight, I'll put the whole base together. And we'll be ready to wrap this project up tomorrow. Well, good morning. Last night, the glue dried on that base assembly, so that's all ready to go. Today, I want to start by working on the top. But first, let's take a look at the prototype and the joint between the leaf and the fixed part of the table. It's kind of unusual. I've never seen one like this before. This part has a round bottom groove, and the leaf has this little bead. There are 2 hinges on which the leaf pivots, and when it's up, that tongue and groove joint gives support to these edges. Otherwise, they could bend down. Now, I want to start by taking the pieces that we glued up yesterday for the top and making that groove in the center panel. Over here at my router station, I've installed a bit like this one. It's a round nose bit, a 1/4 inch diameter, and I've set the height just right, installed the featherboard, and what I want to do is run the piece through on both faces, and that will guarantee me that that groove is centered. Now I've switched over to a roundover bit. This is a 1/4 inch radius roundover. I have an 1/8 inch roundover installed in the table. One pass on each face will form that tongue. All right, let's see how we did. That fits nicely. The next step is to mortise for some hinges. One will go here and one will go here. We're looking at the underside of the table. Here's a sample I made up from some scrap of the hinge already mortised in place. It's a drop leaf hinge. To cut the mortise, I made a template out of plywood, and the cutout in the template is just slightly bigger than the hinge itself. I'm going to mortise it using my router, which has a bearing at the top of the bit. That will ride around the inside of the cutout, and the bit will mortise it. Because this is the underside of the table, I can secure the template with just a couple brads. We'll never see those holes. Now I just use a spring-loaded corner chisel to square up the corners. The next thing to do is to make a slot in the leaf to receive the barrel from the hinge. To do that, I've set up this straight edge clamp. I have a 1/4 inch round nose bit in my router, and I'll just plow out enough material for that barrel. Now the ellipse. First I have to lay it out. So I have two axes, one along the width of the table and one along the length of the table. I've made this marking device that has a pencil on one end, and the distance from the pencil to the first pin is half the narrow side of the ellipse, and the far pin is half the long side of the ellipse. I place those up against these guides, making sure the pins stay in contact as I swing it around. And when I get 1/4 of the way around, I have 1/4 of the ellipse. I repeat this 3 times, and it's all laid out. I actually discovered this method on the internet. So I'm going to be nice and patient and leave the line. To smooth up the cut left by the bandsaw, I'm using my belt sander, just taking the line away. The first step in treating the edges of the top is to round the top corner with a 1/2 inch radius bit. I'll do it in 2 passes because I'm removing a lot of material. Now I'll treat the bottom edge with a smaller bit. What I'm doing here is laying out one of the 2 supports which will hold up the drop leaves on the table. I took some measurements of the antique and made this template out of 1/4 inch plywood. Now I'll cut it at the bandsaw. Just as with the top, I'm going to leave the line. With my spindle sander, I'll smooth the edge and just remove that line. Using a portion of a 1/2 inch roundover bit, I've eased the back edge of the support so it'll clear the rails of the table as it's operated. Now I've switched to a 1/8 inch radius bit to ease the corners on the decorative edge. I need to form a 1/2 inch diameter pin at the bottom of the support to go into that hole we drilled in the rail. I'll make the initial cuts at the bandsaw. Using a saw and a chisel and then some sandpaper, I'll complete that pin. Now I've installed the supports, and I'm going to take a little wedge and hold it away from this rail a bit so it won't hit it as it swings around when the table is fully complete. And take this straight edge, lay it across the top, and mark the cut along the top of the support. That way, the top of the table will sit nice and flat when it's open. I don't know the exact angle of that cut. So what I'm going to do is take my adjustable bevel gauge, set it against the back of the piece, and align it with the pencil mark. Once that is set, I can then set the gauge against the miter gauge for the saw, swing it around until it's parallel to the saw blade, lock it down, and we'll be ready to make the cut. Now I want to drill a hole in the top of the support for a 1/2-inch dowel pin, which will fit into the bottom of the table. I've set my doweling jig square to the back of the support, and I'll drill a hole about 3/4 of an inch deep. Okay, a little bit of glue in that hole we just drilled. Piece of 1/2-inch dowel, tap it in, and then I'll trim it off, leaving about a 1/2 inch stick out. Now I'll use the 1/2-inch bit and just drill down a 1/2 inch deep. All right. Now let's set the base on the top. And I did a pre-fit, so I got them lined up where I want them to be. And I'm going to secure it with these clips. You've seen me make them before. It's just a clip with a little tongue on it that slips into the grooves that I made in the rails earlier. And we'll put about 8 of these in place, and we'll be done with the woodworking. A little more sanding, and this piece will be ready for the finishing room. For the finish on our butterfly table, we're going to turn to a formula given to us by Michael Crow, who's the head finisher down at Leonard's Antiques. And the recipe here calls for us to first mix up some stain. It's a water-based stain, so we mix 3 parts of American cherry with 1 part standard brown walnut. And I'm applying it with a rag. Just rub it in and even it out. And once I get everything coated inside and out, underneath, everywhere, every edge, every surface, we'll coat it with some shellac. After the stain dried, we applied a coat of shellac and then used 3/0 steel wool to smooth it down. And now I'm up to the next step, which is to apply this glaze. It's an oil dispersion. I like to put it on with a rag, and as you can see, it takes away all the grain when you initially put it on. But if I massage it, I can even it out and give a nice, rich look to this cherry. Now, after I go over the whole piece, we'll let it dry overnight, and then we'll start to seal everything up with some polyurethane. Well, here it is, our butterfly table with several coats of hard-wearing polyurethane. We got a dust-free finish, and we got the color just the way we wanted it. This will be a very useful project, and it was a lot of fun to build. Now let me show you what we're going to build next time. It's called a folding screen. We got the idea from an article in This Old House magazine about folding room dividers. In the article, they showed an antique screen made out of mahogany, which inspired this one. So next time, we'll build our own folding screen right here in the new Yankee Workshop.
Funding is provided by